Hello, and welcome to Meet Your Alderman, the podcast that aims to inform Chicago residents about the people who represent them. I'm Sarah Scott, updating my non-deep dish pizza bucket list.
And I'm Eric Geber, who's nervously waiting for real winter to break out any minute now. Election season in Chicago is in full swing, if you didn't already know it. 9 mayoral candidates are contending for their chance to lead the city, with one of them fighting hard to win a second term. But these contests are playing out in every ward as well. All 50 wards will be holding elections for their own aldermen, and the unprecedented level of aldermanic turnover this year should make for an even more interesting election.
In our last episode, we talked to David Axelrod, who provided excellent insights into the upcoming mayoral race. Today, we sat down with Heather Cheron, political reporter for WTTW, to go even deeper and examine the interesting aldermanic dynamics that are playing out. Don't get us wrong, she had plenty of things to say about this slate of mayoral candidates, but Heather knows just about as much as anyone about the full political landscape in the city.
Heather Cheron is a Chicago native who earned her bachelor's and master's degrees at Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism. After spending time reporting on politics in Oakland and LA, she moved back to her hometown and started reporting on the blood sport that is Chicago politics. And as you're going to hear, those are her words. Heather has worked for publications both large and small, such as the Chicago Tribune and the Daily Line, and she even launched DNA Info Chicago. Also, and conveniently, she's currently serving as an IOP Fellow here at the University of Chicago.
This interview is filled with comprehensive insights from Heather as she draws on Chicago's history to explain the urgency of the political issues we see today. The election brings many questions front of mind about the electoral process in the city. Why is the election season in February? What is the difference between a progressive candidate and a Democratic Socialist candidate? How do the runoffs work? And the age-old question, what's up with the Democratic machine?
We hope you enjoy.
Heather, thank you so much for joining us today. We're super excited to have you. And just for listeners, Heather is an Institute of Politics Fellow this quarter. And so she's been on campus giving us the rundown of mayoral elections in Chicago, aldermanic elections, and all things Chicago.
I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much. I think just jumping into it, what really excites you about the city? And then we know that in your previous post as a journalist, you reported in LA and Oakland. So what differentiates Chicago from those cities?
So I grew up in Chicago, so Chicago is home to me. And politics in Chicago is a blood sport in ways that it really isn't in cities like New York and Los Angeles. It is both very parochial and also sort of something that people in all walks of life get involved with and feel connected to. So it is a great city to cover politics in because everybody cares. You don't sort of have to make the case for why you should care about this. And nobody cares about it more than this week, where we're about to potentially elect a new mayor. We're going to elect at least a half a dozen new city council members, and we're starting this sort of grand experiment of elected district councils to oversee the police department, which is really a new era in police accountability and civilian oversight.
And that so much of your answer tracks with what we've heard from Joe Ferguson. We talked to David Axelrod. He said very much the same thing. I'm curious, why do you think that is? So specifically, you mentioned blood sport and you mentioned parochial, but you also mentioned that there's a lot of just engagement that might be higher than in other cities. So, why do you think that is in Chicago?
Well, I think it goes back to Chicago's history as a machine town. So 50 years ago, if you wanted to work for the city, and a lot of times if you were an immigrant from Poland or other Eastern European nations or Ireland or Italy, your path to a middle-class life was really through government work. And in order to get those jobs, you had to be a part of that political operation. So if you lived in a certain part of town, you were part of sort of that part of town's political organization, and it sort of worked its all the way up to and through the city council to the mayor. So if you were an Irish immigrant coming here, in the 1920s, chances are your family started in a factory or in domestic work. And then maybe you were able to get your son a job with the city. And to get a job with the city or the county or any other level of government, you had to be part of that political operation. And the quid pro quo was clear, and it was legal back then. If I hire you, you're going to vote for me. And if I hire you, I'm open to hiring your cousin and your second cousin and your wife's third cousin in return for loyalty. So in some ways, politics was much closer to Chicagoans than it was in other cities. Now, this is certainly true for machines in New York and Boston. I think the Chicago machine lasted a little bit longer than those machines. So it's not like ancient memory for a lot of Chicagoans. It's my dad worked for the city and he was a part of this political organization, which was part of the daily political organization. And I think that people really care about their neighborhoods and they care about their cities. And, we've got that a little bit of second city mentality chip on our shoulder. And I think, Chicagoans really care about Chicago. Not that New Yorkers don't love New Yorkers, but my experience has been that if you're a New Yorker, you consider yourself perhaps first a Manhattanite first or a Brooklynite first. In Chicago, certainly we care about neighborhoods, but we're Chicagoans first.
Yeah. Do you think that the 50-ward system that we have, everyone talks about it, the fact that our wards are very small compared to other cities, do you think that kind of facilitates the system that you just described?
Absolutely. So the cliche is that Chicago is a city of neighborhoods, and it really is, because the way that the city council was set up was that each alderperson was sort of the head of that little part of the city. So you can think about one mayor and 50 mini mayors.
Right.
And the idea is that this would be a level of government that regular people could access, regardless of their, ability to sort of make campaign contributions or to, host, events or anything along those lines. So it was created as a very sort of service-oriented delivery system. So that's why people sort of, are very attached to that system, because it was designed not to set policy. That was really always the role of the mayor, but really to provide direct services to Chicagoans.
Right. And I guess I'm curious, as we have seen a lot of the wards change demographically, what are some things we should look out for in the future, and kind of how is that changing the landscape, the political landscape, not only, also the cultural landscape, obviously?
So really, this is the first election where Chicago is a city of 1/3. So Chicago is a third Latino, a third white, and a third Black. And that means that we're at this moment of really serious demographic flux. So Black Chicago feels very imperiled right now because the Black population of Chicago is dropping for a lot of reasons. And with that drop in population raises the possibility that they will lose clout at City Hall, that they will see that political power that they have really sort of, started to build since the early 1980s start to diminish. And that is a source of great anxiety in that community. On the other hand, you have the Latino community that really feels like it's coming of age politically, and that this is their moment to seize power at City Hall and really make sure that their communities are represented proportionally to their population. And then at the same time, you have a really significantly growing Asian population in Chicago. So Chicago's Chinatown is one of the few in the country that's still growing. And for the first time, the city will have one ward with a majority of Asian American voters. And it will be very interesting to see sort of how that base of political power Asian Americans use to sort of really advocate for their community and the issues that they face.
And that's a really, that one you're talking about, the 11th ward.
Correct,
And that's just a really interesting, we actually had Nicole Lee on.
Oh, exciting.
And we talked so much about, I think it's one of the more interesting ones because of the changing demographics, but also the history. This is going to take us down a little bit of a sidetrack here, but one thing that's really interesting there is that the 11th ward is where Daley Jr. and Sr. both lived there. It was Daley Thompson who was the alderman before Nicole Lee. And the Daleys, I think, still exercise some control because John P. Daley, who lives there, is still the ward committeeman. And this is a weird thing that I was hoping you could help us answer a little bit is, what is the role of these, the ward committeemen? They're super not, I don't think voters know much about them. And I'm curious what control they might have or what remnants of the machine exist through that structure.
So in the olden days, typically if you were the alderperson, you were also the ward committeeman. And the ward committeeman is an elected position, but it is an unpaid position. And each ward of Chicago is supposed to have two committee people, a Republican committee person and a Democratic committee person. So your job as the Republican or truly more the Democratic committee person is to set the agenda for the Cook County Democratic Party. So you are involved in slating judges. You are charged with replacing, retiring, or resigning members of the Illinois Senate or the Illinois House. Now, it used to be, when the heyday of the machine, that ward committeeman power had significant ability to hire people across all levels of government. Now, because of court decisions and just sort of changing times, the ward committeeman no longer has that power. So those positions have been significantly diminished. But in a ward like the 11th ward, it is not insignificant that a member of the Daley family still holds that committee person. And I would say that while Nicole Lee is the first Chinese American to serve on the city council, and she's the first Asian American woman to serve on the city council, she is still very much a part of the Daley machine. Her father worked for Richard M. Daley at City Hall. He was one of his deputy mayors, and just this past weekend, she was endorsed by Richard M. Daley, the former mayor, who has largely receded from public life. And I think it was a very critical moment for him to sort of reemerge publicly to endorse Nicole Lee, essentially telling those older white Bridgeport residents, she is part of our group. She may look a little different, but she is part of our family, our extended family. And I think that is an indication that she is perhaps feeling a little bit behind the eight ball, and that maybe she's got to pull out the stops to win a full term under her own power.
Right. Is it generally, are there negative connotations with being part of the machine still? Or, because I mean, it was such a huge piece of Chicago politics, as you said, and in a lot of ways, I could see it as negative, I could see it as positive, I could see it as kind of neutral.
Well, so the machine does not exist in the same way that it used to exist. So if you are going to say somebody's part of the machine, you really have to figure out, what are you saying? Do you have the support of the Daleys, or do you have institutional backing so that you'll have the ability to get people to the polls and to send out mailers and to perhaps do digital advertisements, that sort of thing. But the power of the machine was really based solely on that transactional, I will give you a job and you will vote for me. And that just doesn't exist anymore.
Yep.
I think that Nicole Lee thinks it benefits her to be associated with the Daley, machine, or what's left of the Daley machine. I think that there are other candidates in that race who would never accept an endorsement from Richard M. Daley. One of the candidates in that race has been endorsed by the Chicago chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. And certainly you would not want to be a socialist endorsed by Richard Daley. That it would create cognitive dissonance. And I think it's really tempting in Chicago, because we all sort of feel comfortable with the machine, to sort of say, well, the Chicago Teachers Union is the new machine, or, something else is the new machine. But unless you're offering people jobs for votes, it really breaks down.
It's hard, yeah. I mean, I think you can draw some connections, but it's really hard to say that the Teachers Union is a machine in the same way that the Chicago political machine, the Democratic machine, was at its heyday. But the 11th Ward thing is, again, a really interesting case, because it also highlights these different shades of, what we've talked about is different shades of blue. I think you look at Chicago from the outside, it's Democratic, it's blue, but once you dig into it, you realize there's different kinds of flavors of that.
Absolutely.
So I think you're one of the, you have many colleagues that could fit this description, but you are someone who I think knows aldermen better than the aldermen themselves. So, looking at the aldermanic races, which wards are you paying attention to? Which ones are really interesting?
Yeah, so the Chicago chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America have endorsed 10 candidates. I will be very interested to see whether they can increase the size of the Democratic Socialist caucus on the city council from 5. If they get all 10 elected, that would just be an incredible sea change at City Hall, because you need 26 votes to do anything with the city council. And if you start with 10, you have something to work with there. So on election night, I will be watching the 25th ward race, which is Byron Sigcho Lopez versus Aida Flores. Byron Sigcho Lopez is one of the 5 members of the Socialist Caucus. He is in a tough fight for re-election. Not only is he being targeted by independent political funds funded by Chicago's business community, he's also being targeted by Chuy Garcia's operation, who is supporting his rival. And so not only do we have business versus socialists, we have an internal battle in the progressive movement about the future of the progressive movement. So if Byron Sigcho Lopez wins, I think that will be an interesting sort of data point. If he loses, I think that the run-ups for the rest of the socialists who advance that second round of voting, I think it will be a different sort of tenor of the race.
And the runoff situation is the same.
Correct.
So you have to get 50%. If you don't, there will be a runoff between the top candidates.
Right.
Got it.
And his opponent, they also identify with the Democratic Socialists?
So she does not. She is just sort of a progressive.
Okay.
Which is really interesting, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's that sort of shades of blue that you were talking about. Like, really, there's only one member of the city council, Anthony Napolitano, on the far northwest side, who is not a Democrat. He says he's also not a Republican.
Right?
Yeah. Right. And so this is really, what flavor of Democrat are you? And this is really a legacy of Harold Washington's election in 1983, because he won the Democratic nomination, but then barely withstood a challenge from the Republican candidate that year, who ran an explicitly racist campaign. Mm-hmm. And in 1995, mainstream Democrats, supported by Republicans, changed the way Chicago elections work to have this nonpartisan election, so that it doesn't matter if you're nominally a Democrat or a Republican, it's just the top 2 vote finishers.
Yep. So since we go right into the mayoral race, who do you think has the best chance of winning now?
I wish I knew. So you sort of have, on the right, you have Willie Wilson, who's the only person running in the race who says he is not a Democrat. And he last ran for the Senate as a member of the Willie Wilson Party, even though he ran for president in 2016 as a Democrat. He says he's neither a Republican nor a Democrat now. And then you have Paul Vallis, who has been a Democrat for many years, ran for governor as a Democrat in 2002, lost, ran for lieutenant governor in 2014 and lost, and now says he is a moderate Democrat. So he is in some ways significantly out of step with sort of the mainstream of the Democratic Party as it exists right now, but was very much the center of it back in the early 2000s. So then as you sort of move leftward, you have candidates like Alderman Sophia King and Alderman Roderick Sawyer, who are members of the Progressive Caucus, but have a lot of moderate progressive positions. And then you have a very similar sort of space occupied by Jesus Chuy Garcia, who has a long history in progressive politics in Chicago and Illinois, but is not sort of embracing sort of new movements in a way. And then you have Lori Lightfoot, who ran as a progressive in 2019, but has not governed as a progressive, and really sort of ran on a reform agenda that she cast as a progressive approach to corruption. And then you have Brandon Johnson, who is a Cook County commissioner. He's supported by the Chicago Teachers Union, and he is running a truly the most progressive campaign in the race, talking about not necessarily hiring more police, but promoting to detectives. And that taking those funds and investing them in violence prevention and job training and other programs designed to attack the root causes of crime and poverty. I would be surprised if the runoff does not feature some combination of Lori Lightfoot, Chuy Garcia, Brandon Johnson, or Paul Vallis. So,
and then real quick to stop you right there, you mentioned runoff. So you seem just about as certain as anyone else that it's just not going to stop at the first time. It's going to go to a runoff.
So there are 9 candidates in the race. If no candidate gets more than 50% of the vote, it goes to a runoff on April 4th. So I think it's just math. That it will work out that way. But it's almost impossible to predict sort of which of those top 4 candidates are going to make it into the runoff. We've seen a lot of different polling, so it's really any candidate's game at this place.
And did you say Lightfoot is one of the 4?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
do you think she'll make the runoff?
I don't know. You can never count out an incumbent mayor. So an incumbent mayor has not lost a bid for re-election since 1983. I was 5 years old when that happened. That was a long time ago.
And you remember that day, right?
I do not. She is running to add another first to her list of firsts. She's trying to become the first woman to be reelected Chicago mayor. The most recent incumbent mayor to lose was, of course, Jane Byrne. And I think that she is facing an uphill battle. But you can't count somebody out who has sort of that name recognition and sort of institutional knowledge, and she's running hard to make it into the runoff.
And Mayor Lightfoot has come under a lot of criticism, for most of her tenure as mayor. Candidly, do you think that she has been a good mayor?
So I think you have to define what you mean by good.
Sure.
I think that she campaigned on a lot of issues that she has not fulfilled. So, for example, she campaigned in favor of an elected school board. When she took office, she changed her mind, essentially, that saying that an elected school board was a bad idea, and that she opposed the legislation that was ultimately signed by Governor Prtizker to create a 21-member elected school board. And she has said recently that she hopes that the General Assembly will revisit that law and will restore mayoral control of the school district. She also campaigned in favor of a elected board to oversee the police department as a way to stop police misconduct. When she took office, she objected to the policy that she helped craft before she was a candidate, while she was a candidate. There have been any number of these sort of, changes. For example, while she was running for office, she endorsed a plan to raise the real estate transfer tax on homes worth more than, or properties worth more than $1 million. Now in office, she is dead set against doing that. So that is why there's been so much energy on the progressive side to elect somebody different, because in a real sense, they feel like Lori Lightfoot sold them a bill of goods, and that they voted for her because of these issues, and she has not fulfilled them. The other issue I think that she has been on the defensive about is police reform. So she has spent much of her career focusing on police reform, and she was picked by former Mayor Rahm Emanuel to lead the task force in the wake of the video of the police murder of Laquan McDonald. And she said that she would quickly and swiftly implement the federal court order requiring the police department to stop violating the constitutional rights for Black and Latino Chicagoans. That consent decree is 4 years old this week. It is 3% fully in compliance. And if you listen to the mayor talk about it at her campaign events and at the stump, she will tell you that it's in 80% compliance. Simply not true. So I think that a lot of people who care very deeply about police reform feel like that is left undone. So whoever is the next mayor will have to fulfill that court order, which is due to expire now 3 years after it was supposed to expire in 2027. And at some point, the federal judge overseeing these reforms is going to get a little bit frustrated that the reforms have been so slow.
Right. So it sounds like to you and probably to most listeners, good governance means what you campaign on is what happens. Would you say, though, in Chicago, I guess kind of going back into, sorry to bring it back up, but when we had the machine, right, there was a lot of just popularity meant you were kind of doing a good job, and being able to just stay in office meant that you had so much power and you had a way to kind of have a continuous momentum
Yeah,
your term.
I think the definition of a successful politician was just different. So if you were somebody who got your job because you voted for Daley and Daley supported candidates, you were happy that Daley was in power because that ensured that you would keep your very, well compensated and pensioned city position. Mm-hmm. And maybe you didn't care about issues like abortion or immigration or affordable housing, because your goal in voting was to ensure that you had access to that middle class lifestyle. That is very different now. And there was a time where you would rarely hear Richard M. Daley or Richard J. Daley talk about issues of national political import. So, you would not see Daley out there talking about Roe versus Wade. You would not see Daley out there talking about immigration at the southern border. Mm-hmm. Those are all issues now that are at the top of the mayor of Chicago's agenda. And that's different and potentially more politically perilous, because if now you have to run a city and make sure it's functioning and the garbage gets picked up and the potholes get filled, now you also have to sort of weigh in on these very fraught issues of sort of national political importance. Those are two very different skill sets, and maybe you're better at one than the other.
That's a really interesting observation. I think hints at there's a bit of a difference in the political expectations in Chicago. And I'm going to offer a bit of an unpopular perspective here. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on it. But I've kind of thought so one thing is Lori Lightfoot, it's been reported that her relationship with city council is not that great and that she struggles with some personal defects in that realm. But I think another aspect of it is when moving away from a machine that kind of enforces loyalty and approaching one that is less machine-oriented. Are we ever going to have a mayor that's as popular as a Daley, especially a Daley senior? Is it just going to be the fact that a more truly democratic system is going to have a mayor that's just not going to be liked by a large swath of the population?
It's definitely possible. I also think that the changing demographic of the city plays into that as well, mm-hmm. because if you were Irish and you traced your lineage to Irish immigrants, you felt personally connected to the Daley clan in a way that I think few Chicagoans feel connected to Lightfoot and her family. Lightfoot did not grow up here. She is from Ohio, so she does mm-hmm. not have sort of generations of Chicago, roots. And I think that plays a role. I also think that mayors, we will never see another mayor be in office for more than 20 years. Mm-hmm. I think that there were many reasons why Rahm Emanuel didn't run for a third term, but I think there is a growing sense that if you serve more than 2 terms, that leads to stagnation. And I think that it will be a very different political era for Chicago to have a series of 1 or 2 term mayors rather than the fact that the most of the last century in Chicago, there were 2 mayors and they belonged to the same family. That's a very different sort of experience.
Yeah. The other side of that here is the fact that we won't have these dynasty, politicians, and I definitely agree with that. To what extent do you think that's also the result of voter expectations differing? How are voter expectations? Are voters the ones driving this attention on national politics, right? Are voters the ones that are moving away from the idea of relying on their alderman and just thinking of their alderman as someone who runs errands for them? How are voters' expectations changed?
Right. I think that there's a generational divide, because if you talk to people who have been in city government for more than a decade, you will hear nostalgia for the era of when sort of city government's entire purpose was filling that pothole on your block. But if you talk to younger politicians, especially those who are on the more progressive side of things, they will say, I'm running to be a legislator. I don't I'm happy to deliver services, but my job is to set policy for the city. And I think those are two sort of diametrically opposed, approaches to the same job. So that's really also, the balance of power is in flux right now. That's also sort of part of that balance of power. Are we going to have a city council that sees itself as an independent legislative body that sets policy? Or do we have a city council that does what the mayor tells it to do, which is how it worked under Daley and both Daley's and Emanuel. Right. So, and that means that if they don't do the policies that you want to do, you feel no personal loyalty to them, and you will give the job to somebody else who can better represent you.
Do you think a lot of the aldermen are leaving, or the tenured aldermen are leaving because they're not ready to be legislators, or that's not really what they signed up for, and they're seeing that switch?
Yeah, some of them are, certainly. I think it's easy to underestimate sort of how many of them are leaving because of the trauma of the pandemic. It was a very difficult time to be somebody who had some sort of civic power, because you watched your constituents suffer and in many cases die, and I think that took a toll on a lot of people. The other thing that's changing is that I think that several of those older people did not really enjoy that antagonistic relationship that Lightfoot had with them. I think that they found that personally draining, and that was not sort of what they signed up for, essentially. And then there are others who just see, 2 terms as a reasonable amount of time to spend in public office. And that is a shift from previous years, that if you got into office, you stayed there as long as you humanly could. And there are certainly some older people who are maintaining that. But we are going to see Ed Burke stop being an alderperson in May. He's been an alderperson since 1969. Before him, his father was an alderperson for, more than a decade. We're also seeing Carrie Austin leave, and she has been an alderperson since 1994. So now the longest serving alderperson will be Walter Burnett, who became mayor under Richard M. Daley. So that is just a generational shift in terms of sort of institutional knowledge and longevity. So it will be a very different city council come, the last week of May.
Who became alderman under Richard M. Daley? Okay, got it. Yep.
So kind of switching focus a little bit, and I'm curious your thoughts about the media coverage of the election. And I was listening to another podcast from another Chicago journalist. If I gave you 3 guesses, you could probably guess who it was. But he was very critical of the coverage that the media had given to certain candidates and not to others and stuff like that. I will say, though, that this journalist had positive things to say about you.
Oh.
Your name came up, and it was he said that you had done a very good job of covering politics. I'm curious your thoughts. Like, do you see a bit of a bias in media coverage for a preference for some candidates over others?
So I think that most of my colleagues do yeoman's work in trying to be fair and accurate and even-handed, and that it's a very difficult, it's a difficult time. It's a difficult sort of race to cover. But I do not think anybody does this job to sort of put their thumbs on the scale. I do think, though, that we're all human. We all make mistakes. We all write stories that we wish we could have back and do better. But, I'm really guided by the sense that my job is to not put my thumb on any outcome, that my job is to make sure that every Chicago voter has all of the information they need to make the best decision for their life and their family, and that I sleep well at night thinking that every Chicagoan is going to vote and that every Chicagoan is going to be the most informed that they possibly could have been, not just from my work, but from everybody else's work. So I think that means that you have to be open to sort of all possibilities, right? I think that it's really easy to think, well, Lori Lightfoot's an incumbent. Of course, she's going to make the runoff. Well, I mean, maybe she was, maybe she isn't. I don't know. And that I think a lot of people look at Chuy Garcia and say, well, of course he's going to get a majority of the Latino vote. Okay, well, certainly his vote is in, or, his base is in Latino Chicago, but I don't know exactly how that's going to play out. So that's something to think about. And then you have Paul Vallis, somebody who, is the only white candidate in the race in a city where race has been at times the only issue in Chicago politics. And I think it would be naive and not helpful to ignore the dimensions of that as well.
No, that's interesting. And then, especially with the mayoral race, and Paul Vallis, his number one issue, as I've heard, his 1, 2, and 3 issue is public safety. You've also talked a lot about police reform and these new efforts to bolster police reform. Those kind of things, like, I'm not going to say that they're at odds with each other, right? But they are kind of attacking the same problem in very different ways. And so I'm curious the role that public safety concerns, but also police reform concerns are playing in this election.
Yeah, I think it was a really interesting moment. I gave a talk, and I think that the audience was mostly white and very wealthy. It was downtown, and somebody asked me to describe which candidate would be best for public safety. And I said, well, I would have to know what you mean by public safety, right? Because if you're somebody who's wealthy and you live in a neighborhood like Lincoln Park, perhaps your concern is carjacking or street robberies or burglaries, and those are all valid concerns. But if you are a single mom who lives in Englewood and you have a 13-year-old son who is Black, I would bet that your bigger concern about being the victim of a crime is that your son will be the victim of police misconduct, and that both of those are public safety issues, and they have very different roots and they have very different solutions. And I think that if I'm at all critical of the media coverage of the election, it's that we tend to flatten public safety into assuming that everybody means the same thing. And I don't think that's true. And I think that we have a police department where the federal government has determined that it routinely violated the constitutional rights of Black and Latino Chicagoans for decades. None of those problems have been solved. And yet we're sort of focused almost entirely on an increase of crime that was significant. And we talk about that almost as a separate issue from sort of the lack of constitutionality in our police department. I see those issues as deeply connected, because if you don't trust the police department to solve a crime that you've been a victim of, I don't know how that works, because the transaction breaks down because of the lack of trust. But if you're only talking about the need for more police officers, then Paul Vallis has spoken a lot about the need for more police officers, but you don't acknowledge that the presence of the police officers makes a significant portion of the city's population deeply scared and deeply uncomfortable. You're speaking to just a limited number of people.
Do you think that any of the candidates are adding dimensionality to this issue?
So I think Brandon Johnson is really the only candidate we've heard say, I'm not going to make hiring more police officers my highest priority. He has said that the department needs more detectives to solve more crimes, but that he sees the addition of police officers is not sort of fundamental to increasing public safety in Chicago. So he wants to take more money and increase it into violence prevention and job training and affordable housing, and sort of to address those root causes of crime. And so we're in this sort of position where the mayor has sort of targeted that as defunding the police. And, of course, his response is that, well, I'm not defunding the police. I'm investing in the things that will actually keep us safe. Sort of two fundamentally different approaches to the same issue. And it will be very interesting to see how that plays out a week from today.
Has Chicago considered any type of rank voting?
So it's really fascinating, because I covered Oakland City Hall in the early 2000s and was there when Oakland passed a ballot measure to go to ranked choice voting. They called it instant runoff voting. And that has been in place now for 2 mayoral elections in Oakland. So part of my brain is kind of confused that it's spoken about in this weird newfangled,
right.
way. And I've been, writing about it for more than 2 decades. So it would take a change in state law for that to take place in Chicago. And whenever you change a system of voting, I think that it's very fraught because there will be losers and there will be winners. And Chicago and Illinois has a long, sordid history of making these sort of changes for explicitly racist reasons. Right. So, the election of Harold Washington prompted the change to nonpartisan elections and the top 2 vote getters going to a runoff. What are we doing with this change? Like, what is it designed to do? And who could suffer and who could benefit? I think it's really sort of got to be part of that analysis. Now, there are a lot of people who are more on the left side of politics who see this as sort of like an efficient, better way to sort of encourage civic participation, and it's somehow fairer than a runoff. I am always very skeptical of people telling me that something will be fairer or better or less, sort of racially tinged, because it is almost never that way.
And then another like systematic kind of question. What are your thoughts about Chicago having what is known as like the off-season election cycle, right? It's in February. The weather right now is actually really nice, but typically it's very, very unpleasant. I mean, do you think that significantly depresses voter turnout? Is that bad for it overall? Would you advocate for having it more in line with other elections?
So there's no doubt that this election is held at the end of February because it benefited the daily machine. And that if you hold an election in an off year with no other offices on the ballot, you are explicitly trying to limit the number of people who will know about those races and who will come out to vote. So if you are somebody whose power relies on being able to give jobs to your supporters, you want only your supporters to come to the polls. And who is more motivated to vote than somebody whose job depends on it, right? So if you move the election to sort of with the governor's election or with the presidential election, there are trade-offs though, right? Because you're going to have a lot of attention on the governor's race, so maybe less attention on the mayor's race. Now, right now, it's all mayor and city council all the time as far as the eye can see. So perhaps that has a benefit in reaching people. But there's no doubt that the roots of this election were not designed to have everybody come out and vote. And there's an argument to be made that that's not how the system should be set up.
Sure. And then I think for our last, about 10 minutes, we really wanted to touch base on your time reporting for City Hall. And this is hopefully going to be phrased well. We'll see. Do you ever get jaded when you're reporting on City Hall day in and day out? And, do you still feel like a sense of hope? Do you feel a sense of, civic duty and all of that as you're in such close proximity?
I sure do. So I am only slightly joking that when I was a kid, my, grandparents and aunts and uncles would say, "What do you want to be when you grow up, Heather?" And my brother would say, "I want to be an astronaut." And I would say, "I want to cover Chicago City Hall and Mayor Richard M. Daley." So this is, my dream job. I am not exaggerating when I say that this is, I have reached the mountaintop. This is all I've ever wanted to do. And there are certainly bad days. There are certainly tough days. And there are days that are frustrating where you feel like either I have, missed the mark and not sort of, served my readers and viewers the best of my ability. But there are also days where it feels like I've been thwarted from doing that just because of a lack of access to information or a lack of response to my questions, that sort of thing. But I don't know a better way to participate in democracy than to be a journalist. And democracy, I think I used to say this 10 years ago and people sort of, looked at me sadly that I was such a giant nerd. But it rings differently now post 2020 that democracy is fragile. Democracy is constantly at risk, even if we have not always realized it is at risk. And the news media and journalists in general have a critical role to play in the health of our democracy. And it is the privilege of my life to be able to sort of participate in that and to function as part of that system and the civic life of the city that I love.
Wow.
Super well put.
Yeah, and
we do have one last question.
Hit me.
Where's your favorite place to get non-deep dish pizza in the city?
Non-deep dish pizza. I got to go with Lou Malnati's.
For the non-deep
For
dish.
the non-deep dish.
That is exactly what David Axelrod
Oh,
said.
no.
Literally
Yes,
less
that's
than
so
2
funny.
days ago.
That's hilarious. I'm in good company then.
Yeah, how is that is it like a tavern style?
It is
that they have?
tavern
'Cause
style.
I don't know if I've had
Yes,
it before.
Yeah, it is tavern style, and they have their butter crust, which I think is
Yeah. Chef's kiss.
chef's kiss. Yeah.
Heather Cheron, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
I had a great time. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. If you liked the show, please rate and review us, and let your friends know. You can also follow us on Twitter by searching the podcast name or the handle Tweet Your Alderman. That's your spelled U-R.
This episode was produced, recorded, and edited by myself and Sarah Scott. Special thanks to Cole Von Glahn for audio support and sound engineering assistance. Graphic design was done by Olivia DePriel. And as always, shout out to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast Group. That's all for now. We'll see you next time.